The music stopped on a Tuesday. Not because Joseph told it to, not because a string snapped or a chord went flat. It stopped because an 8-year-old boy, sitting on the edge of the couch in the corner of the front room, held up one small hand and said quietly but clearly, "Tito, that note is wrong." The word wrong came out of him with no hesitation, no apology, no sideways glance at his father to check whether the speaking of it was permitted. It was simply an observation, delivered with the calm certainty of someone reporting a fact about the weather. The front room on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, went silent in a way it almost never did. Tito's fingers froze over the strings. Jackie looked up. Jermaine turned his head. Marlon, who had been shuffling through a step in the far corner, stopped mid-move, and Joseph, who had been standing with his arms crossed near the door, let his eyes move slowly from the guitar to the boy on the couch. The boy didn't flinch. He just sat there with his small hands folded in his lap, looking at his brother the way someone looks at a page in a book they've read before and found the error. In the kitchen doorway, 14 feet away, Katherine Jackson had been holding a dish towel without moving for nearly 30 seconds. She'd come to call them in for dinner. She hadn't called. She was watching her 8-year-old son in a way that made her chest feel tight and full at the same time. The way it does when you see something you expected and feared and hoped for all at once. Joseph said, "Play it again, Tito." Tito played it again. "Now play what he's saying." Tato corrected the note. The difference was small. A trained musician might have caught it. An 8-year-old with no formal training had no business catching it at all. Joseph's jaw moved. He looked at Michael a second longer than he'd looked at any of his other sons that evening. Then he said, "From the top," and the front room filled with music again, and the moment passed like it had never happened. But Katherine had seen it, and Katherine did not forget. She went back to the kitchen. She set the dish towel on the counter. She stood at the stove for a moment, with her hand resting on the surface, and looked out the small window above the sink at the narrow strip of yard between their house and the neighbor's fence, and she thought about what she had just seen, and what it meant, and what it was going to cost. That was the thing about being a mother. You couldn't just see the gift. You had to see everything attached to it. Dinner that night was fried chicken and collard greens and cornbread, made from a recipe Katherine's own mother had given her years ago in a kitchen, not entirely different from this one. The boys ate quickly. Joseph ate without speaking. Michael ate half of what was on his plate and kept looking at the window as if he could still hear the guitar through the glass, as if the music had left a frequency in the air that only he could detect. Here is what Joseph saw at that table: a talented child who needed more discipline, more repetition, more hours, a product being refined, a voice being sharpened into a weapon. Here is what Katherine saw: a boy who couldn't turn it off, who was already somewhere else, still inside the song, still working on the note, still listening to something no one else in the room could hear. Same child. Two completely different visions of what he was. After dinner, Joseph told them they had 20 minutes, and then they were back in the front room. The older boys scattered. Randy, still too small to perform, trailed after Marlon. Katherine cleared the plates. Michael stayed at the table after everyone had gone, running his finger along a groove in the wood grain, following it back and forth in a slow, repetitive motion that reminded Katherine of the way he sometimes fell asleep. Gradually, reluctantly, as though consciousness was something he gave up, only when his body absolutely insisted. She sat down across from him. "You hear it before it happens, don't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. Michael looked up. He thought about it in the honest way children do before they learn to give answers. People expect. "I hear what it should be," he said. "And then I hear what it is. And sometimes they're different." That sentence, 8 years old. Think about what it takes to know the difference between what a thing is and what it should be. and to trust that knowledge enough to stop an entire room. Katherine folded her hands on the table. Outside, from the direction of the Jacksons' front room, the sound of Joseph's voice carried through the wall. Not the words, just the cadence. The low, insistent rhythm of a man running a rehearsal the way he once ran a shift on the factory floor. Two things he understood: production and repetition. You work the problem until the problem becomes the solution. You drill until the muscle stops making errors. He had learned that in the steel mill and brought it home and applied it to 5 boys who had no choice but to absorb it. Joseph was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one. Katherine had understood that long before most people would have believed it, long before the interviews and the retrospectives and the decades of distance that let everyone form clean opinions about who he was and what he had done to his sons. She had watched him come home from the mill for years, the tiredness in his shoulders that he refused to carry into the room, the way he straightened himself in the doorway before the boys saw him, the deliberate construction of a posture that said nothing is wrong, everything is moving forward, nobody stops. The man who pressed his sons that hard, who corrected every mistake with such unflinching precision, was a man who had seen what happened to people who stopped pushing. He had carried hot metal in his hands for years. He had watched his own ambitions narrow to a single track and close. He was not going to let that happen to his children. He loved them in the only language available to him, which was the language of survival. But survival was not the same thing as the gift Katherine had just watched her youngest son use in that front room. She reached across the table and smoothed Michael's hair back from his forehead. He let her, though he was at the age where brothers would have teased him for it. She studied his face, the round cheeks, the wide eyes that already held something too old for his 8-year-old frame, the expression of a person whose mind was perpetually working on something slightly ahead of wherever they were. "Michael," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, the way it got when she was saying something she'd been holding for a while. He was watching her with full attention. That was one of the things about him. When he decided to be present, he was entirely present. There was no half-listening, no distraction. His eyes were completely still. "I knew you were different," she said. "The moment you were born." The word different hung between them. Michael turned it over. At 8 years old, different was a complicated word. Different from what? Different how? Different could mean better, or it could mean separate, or it could mean alone. And he wasn't sure which one his mother meant. And he wasn't sure she entirely knew either. "Different like the guitar?" he asked. Katherine blinked. "What do you mean?" "Like when the note is wrong. That's different too. But it sounds bad." She felt something move in her chest. She took his hand between both of hers. "No, baby." Different like she stopped, looked at the window, looked back at him. Different like when you hear what it should be. That kind. The kind that makes something better. From the front room, Joseph's voice cut through. 5 minutes. Michael's body shifted almost imperceptibly toward the sound. The pull of it was already inside him. Not fear exactly. Not pure obedience either. Something more like gravity. The front room was where the work happened. The work was the thing. His father had made sure of that. But something else had just happened in this kitchen. Something that had no language in Joseph's world. Katherine had given him a different kind of knowledge. Not about what was required of him, but about what he already was. You couldn't drill that into a person. You couldn't run it like a rehearsal. It was either there or it wasn't. And in her son, at 8 years old, it was already there in a way that made her proud and afraid in equal measure. She kissed his forehead. "Go on," she said. "Don't be late." He slid off the chair and ran toward the front room. Katherine stayed at the table. She listened to the door open, and Joseph say something, and the guitar start again, and she sat with her hands, still folded, and thought about the particular weight of knowing your child is carrying something extraordinary, and the particular helplessness of not being able to protect them from what that will ask of them. Joseph never talked about different. Joseph talked about better, best. Number 1. Win. His vocabulary was the vocabulary of competition, because competition was a system with clear rules. You either won or you didn't, and if you didn't, it was because you hadn't worked hard enough. That framework had kept his family housed and clothed, and moving forward, and he believed in it the way other men believed in Scripture. What he couldn't see, what he had no framework for seeing, was that Michael wasn't competing. Michael was listening, and those were not the same activity. The rehearsal ran until 9:30 that night. Katherine could hear the music from the kitchen as she washed dishes, the same phrases repeated, corrected, repeated again. Joseph's voice punctuating the silence between takes like a metronome set to impatience. Again, from the top, no, like this. Do you hear the difference? The irony of that last phrase was something Katherine noticed and did not say aloud. She dried the last plate and set it in the cabinet and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment. Through the doorway, she could see the lamp still burning in the front room. She could see the boys moving in the warm light, the taller shapes of her older sons, the smaller shape of Michael, already center, even at that age, already the one, the others organized around without anyone having decided it. Consider that for a moment. Nobody told those boys to orbit him. No one assigned positions. It just happened. The way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, drawn by something invisible, something that predates any decision anyone makes. Joseph would say he had built that. And he wasn't entirely wrong, but Katherine had seen what happened before Joseph got there. She had seen the hand go up. She had seen the older boy stop. She had seen the room rearrange itself around an 8-year-old who heard what no one else had caught. You can train a voice. You can drill a body. You can teach a child to want to win so badly that the wanting becomes a kind of fuel. Joseph understood all of that, and he was good at it, and his sons were going to be successful, partly because of it. But you cannot teach someone to hear the wrong note that arrives differently. It arrives the way Katherine had described it, at birth or not at all. The light in the front room went out at 9:47. She heard the sounds of boys moving through the small house, the back door, footsteps on the stairs, Marlon's voice, Tito's heavier tread, Jackie saying something to Jermaine. Then Michael last through the kitchen door, stopping for a moment in the light that was still on. He stood in the doorway in his small sneakers with his hands at his sides. He looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had processed something over the course of several hours and arrived at a question. "Mama," he said. Si sectus. If I hear what it should be." He paused, working it out. "Does that mean I have to make it that way?" Stop and hold that question in your mind. An 8-year-old exhausted, asking not whether he's allowed to, but whether he's obligated to, whether hearing the right thing creates a responsibility to pursue it. That is not a child's question. That is the question every serious artist spends their entire career answering. Katherine turned from the sink. She looked at her son in the kitchen doorway, 8 years old, exhausted from 2 hours of rehearsal, still thinking, still at it, already carrying something that most people spend their whole lives looking for. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it means." He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he went upstairs to bed. Katherine listened to his footsteps on the stairs, lighter than his brother's, quicker, already carrying him somewhere before his body caught up. That was 1966. The Jackson 5 didn't exist yet. Motown was a name Michael had heard, but couldn't fully picture. A city within a city somewhere in Detroit. A place where voices became records, and records became something that came out of radios, in kitchens and cars and barbershops across America. The machinery of it was invisible to him then. What he knew was the front room, the couch, his brother's voices, his father's count-off. That was the whole world. Joseph knew a fraction of what was coming. He had seen enough to know his son was exceptional, and he had built a machine around that exceptionality and aimed it at success with everything he had. Katherine knew something. Joseph didn't. She had seen the hand go up before the machine existed. She had heard her son describe sound the way other people describe color, as something with a shape, a rightness, a wrongness that could be felt before it could be explained. She had sat across a dinner table from an 8-year-old and watched him search for language for an experience that most adult musicians couldn't articulate. She had given him the only words she had: different, special, a very special life. They were inadequate words for what she had seen, and she knew it, but they were true, and she said them anyway, and Michael had taken them with him back into the front room, and back upstairs, and forward into every rehearsal, and every recording session, and every stage in every city that would come after. Joseph's voice would always be there, harder, louder, pushing, demanding, refusing to accept anything less than perfect. That voice would drive the engine for years. It had its own kind of love in it, the compressed and pressurized kind, that doesn't know how to soften without fearing it will stop working entirely. But Katherine's voice was there too, quieter, earlier, closer to the root of the thing. You hear what it should be. That's different. That kind of different makes something better. The years would put enormous distance between that kitchen and everything that came after. The Motown singles, the tours, the television appearances, the Grammy stages, the stadiums, and the records, and the phenomenon that would eventually require a title because the ordinary language of success was no longer sufficient. But if you traced it back, past the costumes and the cameras and the choreography and the mythology, you arrived eventually at a Tuesday evening in Gary, Indiana, and a small boy raising his hand in a front room, and a mother standing in a kitchen doorway who saw something and held it and gave it back to him at the end of the night in the only words she had. Two voices shaped Michael Jackson. One told him what he had to become. One told him what he already was. He needed both. He spent his whole life carrying both, and the distance between them, between what was required and what was innate, between the machine and the gift, between his father's language and his mother's. That distance was the space where everything he ever made came from. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. There is a version of this story that goes further. What happened the first time Michael couldn't reconcile those two voices? The night the distance between them became something he had to choose between. If you want to hear it, tell me in the comments. Some stories only make sense when someone asks for them.